Food is always the way. Yeah, for sure. I don't know where it wants it. Where do you want it? Sitting out right when they take there's extra cheers to it. And I promise not to filibuster.
Mind if I make a quick announcement? Erev Tov, we're going to start in a few minutes. If you like, we didn't promise it's going to be a short evening. So if you like, there's refreshments, there's coffee, there's tea. Please help yourself. I'm just going to ask, the first two rows are designated for the survivors on the right, on my right, and on the left for our elected officials, if you make sure that everybody has a seat.
Okay, that's all I've seen. Sure, and I'll look. If anything happens, throw your hand up and I'll ask and then I'll know. But I left the proclamation there. Hopefully that's okay. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. And I have a thing. Yeah, and I have a thing. We're here? No. Over in where is it? Oh no, there's two. There's one at Charlie's Yeah, there's parking. There's parking. Yeah.
Chief, one thing I wanted to tell you about the fire.
The which sir?
Survivors?
Yes.
You would have to help them.
Well, I'm asking somebody. So it's going to be 9, eh?
There's 9 candles.
Because I didn't have a count.
I double checked with the Italian.
I'll ask.
Good evening, everyone. I think we're ready to start, and everybody can be seated.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. No, just Kelly. Just you're all right.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Keith Litke, the president of the Bayit. Really appreciate everybody coming. It looks like we have a full house. I apologize for anyone that's standing and doesn't have a chair, but I'd like to ask the Rabbi Levy, to come up and say a few words.
Erev Tov. There's still some seats. It won't feel the same if people are standing.
Perhaps if anybody's sitting next to an empty seat, maybe raise your hand so people know.
Now, it could be they're standing because they want access to the coffee. I don't know.
Actually, there's one seat at the front. If there's a lady or someone that it'll help for sitting, I will let them have my chair.
Yes, yes. Yeah. We are honored once again to come now the 6th year in a row to host our dear mayor who makes a proclamation and to hear a testimony from a survivor. You know, Zachor, we are obligated to remember. We're obligated to liskor. Anachu mechuyavim liskor. We are obligated to remember today, tomorrow, and really every single day. I feel like I may have said this last year, but it's true today, perhaps even more than it was last year. That Zachor is always important, but it feels like today it's even more important than ever before. You know, I think we're honored to have 9 survivors in the crowd. And I think about the survivors. I think about my own father, who is not with us this evening. He's in Israel, whose childhood was robbed from them. And now in the golden age, thank God, living in the best place on earth in beautiful British Columbia. Once again, the fear of anti-Semitism, both here and of course in the Holy Land, is ever more present. Every day after our morning services, we have 6 things that we have to remember. We have the Shesh Schirot. Because as much as we want to focus on the future, as much as we want to continue to build and not always think about our dark past, the only way to ensure a proper future is by remembering the atrocities, the hardships of the past. And we are lucky that we still live in an age that we could come into a room and to witness survivors stand and share their testimonies. And it's our obligation. There's not too many young people in the crowd. It is our obligation to take these stories and make sure that they will never, ever be forgotten. Dr. Sufil, thank you so much for being here. It's a great honor. Thank you to each and every one of you for coming here. It's a limited house and a limited space. We have the obligation to share these stories with one other, with 5 others, with 10 others, today, tomorrow, next month, next year. So that never again is not just a slogan that we say once a year in International Holocaust Remembrance Day, but it's also every single day confronting hate, anti-Semitism, every single time it raises its ugly head. So, Erev Tov, thank you for being with us, and may we continue to only, God willing, get together for simchas.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. I would like to acknowledge the following elected representatives and the leaders of the Jewish community for joining us this evening. From the city of Richmond, we have our really good friend, Mayor Malcolm Brody, and his wife, Christine. For councilors, and please, if I miss anyone that came in and I didn't see them come in, please raise your hand. But the ones that I did see, I saw Andy Hobbs, Councillor Andy Hobbs. Councillor Alexa Liu. And Councillor Bill McNulty. Is there anyone from the school board here? Any trustees? I didn't want to miss them if they were here. Having fun with this microphone. From the provincial legislature, we have all 4 MLAs.
I will try my best. I'm sorry.
Thank you. That's what happens when you're tall. It would be even trickier if Andy was up here. Anyway, Kelly Green, the Honorable Kelly Green is the MLA for Steveston Richmond East, and she's actually our MLA for the synagogue. We have the Honorable Teresa Watt, and she's the MLA for Richmond Bridgeport. The Honorable Steve Cooner, MLA for Richmond Queensborough. And the Honorable Han Chan, MLA for Richmond Center. From Ottawa, we have our 2, I'm not sure if we have both MPs, but I know that we have our MP, Member of Parliament, Parm Baines, the riding of Steveston, Richmond East. Parm, is Wilson here? I don't think he is. Okay. From the RCMP, we have RCMP Chief Superintendent Dave Shohan. I wanted to thank Dave, yourself and your colleagues, all the RCMP, from everybody that's taking care to protect us, for keeping our community safe. We really appreciate it. From the Jewish community, we have Ezra Schenken, the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Vancouver. We also have a special friend of the Bayit, our former president, now the director of Western Canada for the Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Michael Sachs. I would now like to ask our provincial MLA for the riding of Richmond Steveston, the Honorable Kelly Green, to come up and say a few words on behalf of Premier David Eby and the government of BC.
Thank you so much for inviting me and my colleagues from the provincial government to be here with you on such an important and solemn day. I'm Kelly Green. I'm the MLA for Richmond Steveston, and I'm also Minister for Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. I'm joined today by MLAs Teresa Watt, Han Chan, and Steve Cooner, and I'm so deeply honored to be here. I also bring greetings from Premier David Eby, who sent a special commemoration for the Bayit, and I'll present that at the end of my remarks. We are gathered here today on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation to recognize International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. This day is to remember and honor those who perished, those who survived, and those who risked everything to save others. 6 million Jews were murdered simply because they were Jewish. They were no threat to anyone. They were shopkeepers, teachers, bakers, artists, students. They loved and were loved. And from the voices of survivors, we must learn their stories so that we may remember them and say never again. We also remember the many others persecuted because of their religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, nationality, or political opposition. The evil of that time swept over the world with destruction, fear, and hate. I am deeply disturbed to see the rise of anti-Semitism here in Canada and around the world, and I am afraid of the Nazi influences in other governments, such as the one with the most powerful military in the world. In British Columbia, we recognize that diversity is our strength, and every person deserves a life of safety and belonging. Recognition for the Jewish community was formalized in the Holocaust Memorial Day Act, passed in May 2000 by Premier Dosanjh's government. Today, we continue the work to fight anti-Semitism and discrimination and to bolster human rights to build a future that we can all be proud of. And I'm always so grateful to live in Richmond, a multi-faith and multi-ethnic community that actively discourages all forms of discrimination. It extends kindness to those in need, regardless of their background. We are steadfast in protecting our right to live in peace and belonging, to have a safe and welcoming place where we raise our kids, go to work, and come together in community. So today we remember and we take action. Never again is an act of promise to each other and to our city and our province and our country. We promise that we will speak up against anti-Semitism and build a society that is safe and inclusive for every single person. Thank you. I'd like to present the certificate to Keith, and if Rabbi Barnai is around.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and big thank you to the Premier, David Eby. I would now like to ask our Member of Parliament for the riding of Steveston, Richmond East, the Honourable Parm Baines, to come up and say a few words on behalf of the Honourable Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Canadian government.
Thank you, Keith. Rabbi Bernai, Mike Sachs, other friends, Ezra Shankin. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share some words, and of course, to the survivors. Thank you again for sharing your stories here today that we'll get to hear shortly. And like our Minister Green mentioned, we are brought together in remembrance of what was and must never happen again. Jews and others the Nazis deemed undesirable were made into the other. Using fear, uncertainty, suspicion as their weapons, the Nazis would fracture German society in their pursuit of power. They would turn people against each other. Slowly, lifelong friends and neighbors turned into strangers, and from strangers into enemies. No longer were they afforded the rights and protections of citizens. They became aliens in their own country, ready victims for the genocidal plans of some of history's most evil men. After the overthrow of Nazi Germany in 1945, the world resolved to never again sit by while the scourge of genocide takes hold in any nation. Tragically, this would not be the last genocide perpetrated in the wake of the Holocaust. Rwanda, Bosnia, the Yazidis, and on October 7th, 2023, the Jewish people in Israel became the victims of targeted racial murder. In the very home created to be a haven for the Jewish people, in the days since the Israel-Hamas war began, thousands have died and a wave of hate has spread across the globe. The inescapable lesson of the Holocaust and the lesson we must never forget is this: there are no other people. There is only us, the community of humanity, which is made stronger by the diversity of its members, subject to one another under the same shared obligation: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. As your Member of Parliament for Steveston Richmond East, I'll continue to fight against the prejudice that seeks to tear our communities apart, but I can't do it alone. By taking a stand and protecting each other's freedom and dignity, we secure our own place, our own right to be different and be a member of a minority, because we are all a member of a minority group. We all exercise that right to be different. Holocaust Remembrance Day is about remembering what happens when we abandon that right out of fear, conformity, or indifference. It is only by standing together as one that we live up to the promise. And never again. Thank you.
Thank you, Parm. I would now like to ask a dear friend and leader of the Jewish community, the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Vancouver, Ezra Schenken, to come up and say a few words.
Good evening, everyone. It is always humbling to speak before our survivor community. I will say, I think we said we have 5 survivors. How many survivors? 5?
I think it's
9, of which 2, one newly minted, are members of the Order of Canada. I think it might have been one of the survivors in this room that reminded me that there is a child survivor in nearly every category of the Nobel Prize. Everyone? Peter, everyone. This from a group of people that psychologists and psychiatrists in the wake of the Shoah said, it's a lost generation. There's no way they could have families. There's no way they could raise children. There's no way they could hold down jobs. And they didn't mean this in a derogatory way. They meant that the horrors that had befallen them would never heal. They would never be able to heal. That they would never be able to live productive lives. We know today that that's not true, that human strength is much stronger than what people thought. And I never understood that until October 7th. As a community leader, as someone who has bore witness to some of the worst atrocities that I've seen in my working and living days serving, I think the resilience of the human spirit is in many ways what we mark today, as we remember those who were lost, but also recognize liberation. And these days, with the return of hostages, liberation is more on our minds than ever before. Every Wednesday, I gather on video and in person with a group of grassroots leaders and professional leaders, and I've been doing this for over 400 days. These individuals are organizing across our community, volunteers and professionals alike, standing up in some of the most hostile environments, pushing back against the scourge of anti-Semitism. Every Wednesday, I get to look at their faces. Some Wednesdays, they're deeply distraught. Some Wednesdays, they're euphoric, their victories. But it reminds me that the concept of never forget is also about never again. And I don't take for granted, I will say this. I am the first one to stand up and to push back against government when I feel that government isn't doing enough. And I do want to recognize that the City Council of Richmond adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and we feel deeply grateful for that. But I will say, if only our ancestors had public officials showing up like this and talking about how we have to create a safer space. It's not easy. It's not easy. It always seems easier than it is. The people have asked me, when do we get out of here? Yeah, we think about that a lot these days. When do we get out of here? We get out of here when the government starts making laws against us. And I will tell you that I feel very grateful that I feel we are not there with our governments, no matter what party we're talking about, that our governments have been steadfast in trying to voice the need for safety and security for the Jewish people and for all people across our country, our province, our cities. And I want to thank them for spending time with us tonight, because time is the most valuable thing in a politician's and a public official's wallet of sorts. The most valuable thing in their wallet that they hold is time. The fact that they give time to us is really, really, really critical. And the last thing that I'll say is this, and I saved this for last, but I should have said it first. During the Shoah, it was the law enforcement that were complicit in so much of the atrocities, either turning a blind eye as buildings burned to the ground on Kristallnacht, or implementing the decrees, the immoral decrees of tyrannical government. I want to say, with our friends from the RCMP here, we are so grateful that our law enforcement here is quite the opposite to those we've seen in the past. They have stood shoulder to shoulder with us, deploying day in and day out across this province to make sure that this Jewish community is safe and secure. I do not, especially on a day like today, take that for granted. I want to thank Dave, and I want to thank the whole crew at the RCMP Richmond Division. Finally, I want to say that I am deeply grateful for each one of you spending the time tonight to mark these moments. Our time with our survivors is cherished time, deeply special time. We have our VHAC folks here who are just doing an incredible job. I want us all to really treasure these moments when we can come together and still bear witness to the individual stories of many. And then I want us to carry it with us as our survivors, hopefully not anytime soon, leave this world for a greater world beyond. Finally, do I introduce Mike Sachs?
You can introduce.
Can I introduce Mike Sachs?
Sure.
Okay, good. This is a This is a pleasure. It's really my deep pleasure to introduce a partner of mine. Mike Sachs has been not just an advocate for this place, but just a relentless advocate for community as a whole. He's been an incredible friend and teammate of mine as we've fought the battles over these past 400 days, 400 plus days. I really, I can't say enough good things about Mike and what he's done for this community, and bringing Simon Wiesenthal here along with the other assets that we have. I believe that we are in the best position we've ever been to be able to not just maintain the stories of the Holocaust, but push beyond as we battle anti-Semitism as it rears its ugly head. With that, it's my pleasure to welcome my friend, Mike Sachs.
Wow. Well, thank you, Ezra, for that wonderful introduction and heartfelt words. On behalf of the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, the organization I have the great honor to represent in Western Canada, I appreciate being here on this meaningful evening. About 6 years ago, this was an idea that has now come to fruition. As already mentioned, tomorrow marks exactly 80 years since the Soviet troops liberated the notorious Nazi death camp, Auschwitz, whose name will forever evoke the darkest chapter in human history. From May 1940 until January 1945, the Nazis murdered more than 1 million people at Auschwitz, mainly Jewish men, women, and children from all over Europe. Auschwitz and the many other sites where the Nazis carried out the Holocaust was fueled by a sinister, state-promoted campaign of vile anti-Semitism. Echoes of such anti-Jew hatred haunts us today, right here in the Lower Mainland, in British Columbia, and across Canada. Indeed, this year's commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day takes place amidst the worst, most sustained amount of anti-Semitism that Canadian Jews have ever experienced. And most worryingly, there is no sign of this toxic scourge subsiding anytime soon, as far too many people choose to look away. It's critical that our politicians, our educators, who I wish some of the school board was here this evening to hear these words, and other leaders make their voices heard. This is not a time for silence. Tragically, throughout history, Jews have learned time and time again the painful consequence of leaders remaining silent in the face of hate against our people. Indeed, the past is so instructive, and hence the importance of teaching the lessons of the Holocaust and modern manifestation of anti-Semitism. Survivors are a constant source of inspiration and wisdom for us and the young people they engage with through programming, some of which with the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. Once again, we must lean on them, on their lived experience to guide us at this pivotal time in history. No one can speak with a greater authority on what can happen when hate is left unchallenged than these survivors. For them, having witnessed firsthand and paid a dear price for society not standing up for the worst impulses of humanity, this is not academic. Indeed, for Jews, with our long history of persecution, made possible by fellow citizens who happen to look the other way. We know only too well what it is to feel alone in difficult times. The Holocaust is Exhibit A. Beyond its incalculable tragedy and sorrow is the lasting psychological wound for Jews for so much of the world ignoring them as the Nazis first carried out their oppression and then extermination. At the same time, we should never forget that a relatively small number of righteous and courageous people risked everything, sometimes paying with their lives, to save Jews from these Nazis. And amidst all the darkness of this period, these extraordinary heroes were a rare source of light, a shining example of moral fortitude and defiance of hatred. Without suggesting Jews are now facing another Holocaust, we urgently need more non-Jews who have the values to stand up and speak out against anti-Semitism. We've learned the hard way that we can never take for granted those who stand with us. All the more reason I want to especially thank all of our elected officials, all of our dignified people, and all the people who are not Jewish who are in this room. And ask everyone here to commit to doubling their efforts of Holocaust education, but also the education and the efforts to ensure the education of modern day manifestation of anti-Semitism. Observing International Holocaust Remembrance Day is a powerful way to drive home the vital importance of not being a bystander to hatred. Jews cannot fight anti-Semitism alone, nor should we. Not if we want a better society for all. The light of education shall lead our way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Ezra. We are blessed to have 9 survivors, 9 Holocaust survivors. Blessed and honored to have them with us this evening, and I'd like to ask them to come forward now to light the memorial candles.
It is my great honor to introduce the candle lighting. We light candles in memory of the 6 million Jews, 1.5 million of whom were children, and millions of other victims. The candles honor the memories of their mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, cousins, husbands, wives, and children who were murdered by the Nazis or their collaborators. Let us vow to never forget. And we're honored to have our mayor light another candle to honor our other victims of the Holocaust.
I'd now like to ask our cantor, Yakov Orzak, to come up and light the, actually, he's going to recite the Kel Alei of Rachamahim. I'd like everyone to stand. Who knows the button? Who knows the button for the light? That's fine. So that's good.
Moli Rachamim, Shoichein, Bameroimim, Amiseyem Menuchonechoino, Al kanfei ha-shechina b'mahalois kedoshim u'toyrim kezohia harakiya Esni Yishmois Hakedoshim v'yatehoyerim שהומתו ושנהרגו ושנשחטו ושנשרפו ושנטבעו ושנחנקו על קידוש השם על ידי הצוירים הגימונים ימח שמם וזכרם וגן עדן בגן עדן תהי מנוחסם לכן בעלו רחמים יסירם בסיסי כנפו ויועל עמים ויצרו בוער בצרוי רחיים אס נשמוי סיים אדוני הוא נחלוסון וינוחו בשלום על משכבו יסיים ונאמר
Maybe see it.
It's now my honor to ask the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center Associate Director of Programs and Community Relations, Abby Wenner-Herlin, to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening.
Opposite problem, we're going down. Thank you so much. So the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center is honored to continue a partnership with the Bayit. It's been many years that we've had this partnership in this wonderful program. So wonderful to see so many of you here. And for those who do not know about the VHEC, we were founded in 1983 by survivors of the Holocaust. based in Vancouver, the goal was to leave a permanent legacy in the form of a center devoted to Holocaust-based education and commemoration. As a descendant on my maternal side, I spent many times at the center as a young girl. I'm very honored to do this work. And through our continuous efforts of education and remembrance, the VHEC engages students, educators, and more of the broader public with the history of the Holocaust and its ongoing relevance. As you know, and why we are here, tomorrow, January 27th, we observe International Holocaust Remembrance Day and the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and Birkenau. We need to reflect on the dangers of anti-Semitism left unchecked and the role that each and every one of us can play in being vigilant and an upstander against hate. Within our Vancouver community, many who are here tonight are Holocaust survivors who were witnesses to Nazi crimes. Others were able to flee persecution or were rescued. Still others survived the unspeakable brutality of the Nazi camps or spent the years in hiding. Today we honor those who survived and we mourn those who did not. The day is also dedicated to promoting Holocaust education. And I encourage you to visit us at the basement of the JCC, and you can find out more about us at vhec.org. Tonight, we have the pleasure of hearing from a survivor of the Holocaust. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Peter Sudfeld to you. He was born in Hungary and emigrated to the United States in 1948. After 3 years of active duty in the US Army, he received a bachelor's degree from Queens College of the City of New York University in 1960 and his doctorate from Princeton University in 1963. He taught at the University of Illinois and at University College Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, before moving to the University of British Columbia, UBC, where he was appointed professor of psychology in 1972. In 2001, he was appointed Dean Emeritus of Graduate Studies and Professor Emeritus of Psychology. Dr. Sudfeld has held Canada Council and Killam Foundation fellowships and sabbatical or concurrent appointments as a visiting professor at the University of New South Wales, visiting fellow at Yale University, distinguished visiting scholar at Ohio State University, and distinguished scholar in residence at the Peter Wall Institute of Advanced Studies. His research is generally concerned with how human beings adapt and cope with novelty, challenge, stress, danger, and traits of resilience. He studied the term adaptation of survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. He's the author of more than 200 journal articles and book chapters. Please join me in warmly welcoming Peter.
Thank you. I think we can get past the title page. All right. I'm going to start out by looking at what psychologists call the assumptive world. And that is the world that we live in and that we think we understand, or at least most of what we need to understand about it, we do. We know how to get from where we are to where we want to be. We want to know how to get food. We do know that. All of these things that we learn are predictable and stable. And they do change somewhat, but they usually change in understandable ways, frequently for understandable reasons. Very frequently, we can predict that it's going to happen, the change is going to come, and so on. So that is the world that, as I said, we all live in. And if you push that button, this is the assumptive world of integrated Jews in Hungary at the time that I was a child, prior to the war and the Holocaust. Integrated means, in the technical sense, that you have the values and customs of two cultures, the one that is your ancestral one, Maybe you were born there, maybe not, but your ancestors somewhere down the line did. And they had a culture of their own, of art, music, food, ways of dealing with each other, hierarchical structures, and so on. And the one where you live now, and the one where your family lives now. So you don't give up one in order to adopt the other, or you don't stay the one that you came in with or your family came in with and ignore the one around you. If you remember things like the movie Fiddler on the Roof, that was a depiction of a Jewish culture that was not integrated. You recall they wore different clothes from the non-Jewish population that they lived among. They ate different foods. They spoke different languages, Yiddish and Hebrew for ceremonious occasions. They had different customs. And they stayed away from the other group. That's an isolated, incidentally located in a particular place, but not feeling any special kind of affinity or loyalty or belonging to that place. Where we lived in Budapest and in much of the rest of Hungary, it wasn't like that. Okay? We spoke Hungarian at home and Hungarian anywhere else we were. We did not speak Yiddish. I never heard that there was such a thing as Yiddish until I got to New York City. Live and learn, eh? I never used to say "eh" either. I was really surprised when I first came to Canada and somebody said to me, "How are you feeling, eh?" Anyway, you know, when I feel I'm among friends, I feel free to ad lib, mostly joke. Anyhow, so we went to public school. I went to a public school that was mostly Catholic, which was the major religion in Hungary, and secondarily Reformed Protestant. Very few Jews, but there were some. We celebrated national holidays like everybody else. We also had our own holidays in addition to that. We did not celebrate Christian religious holidays except for Christmas. Everybody had to have a Christmas tree. Now, there was a community in Budapest and more around the countryside that was much more Orthodox and had very little to do with the normal, in the sense of numerically dominant Hungarian culture, but most Jews in Budapest belonged to the integrated group. They were variably religious. Some were more religious than others. Pretty much everybody observed the holy days. Some kept kosher, some did not, and so on. Everybody got along pretty well. The synagogues were, again, pretty liberal in the sense that they let in and welcomed people regardless of how strictly they kept the dietary and other laws. And so we understood ourselves to be Hungarians of Jewish faith and Jewish origin. And if you look further east in Europe in those days, the people there thought of Jews there mostly thought of themselves as Jews who happened to live in Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, whatever. Okay? That was not us. We were Hungarians first. Hungarians were used to us. We, in fact, Jews were in what is now Hungary before the majority Hungarian ethnic group, Magyars, got there, because the first Jews arrived with the Roman legions in the first century of the Common Era. The Magyars didn't get there till a couple hundred years later. So we felt at home. Okay, we were Hungarians like everybody else, minor differences. There were other groups that had minor differences, people from German backgrounds or some from Russian backgrounds and so on. But if you asked us, you know, what are you? Who are you? The answer would be Hungarians. And interestingly, we thought that that's what the people around us thought also. that that's what we were, Hungarians. It turned out a little later that we were mistaken in that belief. Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was one of the biggest empires in the world at the time, I think second largest. And it comprised what then became, after World War I, where the Austro-Hungarian Empire was on the wrong side, i.e. the losing side. It was broken up and something like 10 independent countries were created out of that empire. Hungary was one of them. In the Treaty of Trianon, which was the part of the peace treaty after World War I that related to Hungary, Hungary lost a tremendous number of people, citizens, about 1/3 of the total population. That's a lot. And almost all of its natural resources of mines. We had bauxite, which is very important in the making of aluminum and aluminum instruments and so on, forests. And we also had vast plains, which were very fruitful in grain, vegetables, and fruit, and also cattle and lambs and so on, sheep and so on. So it was a rich and self-sufficient in many ways and contented country. The defeat of the Austro-Hungarian Empire led to some upheaval in that. The country was pretty much impoverished because all those resources were taken away and allocated to countries that had not fought against the victorious allies. So there was an irredentist movement of wanting to get it back. It was ours, and they took it away from us. We wanted it back. That included the people, the Hungarian citizens who were now Romanian citizens or Czech citizens. They spoke Hungarian. They were Hungarian, and they were very resentful of now being under the domination of a different government, which had a different language and which enforced the use of their language instead of Hungarian and so on. Next one. Okay. So I'm going to talk mostly about two families, my mother's and my father's, both of which, of course, were mine. This is the Ákos family. That was my mother's family. I'll let you guess who that very handsome young boy in the middle was. Oh, you guessed. Good. Okay. And I want you to note for further memory, because I'll remind you of this, the blonde hair. Okay. On the left side of the picture are my aunt and her husband, one of my aunts and her husband. And in the center behind me are my mother and father. And between them and me are my grandparents. There was also another sister. I don't see her in there. Oh, yeah, she's on the extreme right as you're sitting. You'll meet all of these people later. Okay, so this was a very happy, fairly well-organized and affectionate family. And everybody doted on me because I was the only child in the group, in the family. So my grandfather was a war amputee. He had lost a leg in battle in World War I. And as compensation, the government gave him a kind of a special access to selling meats, livestock to the army. He was a butcher by trade. And he got to be quite rich, except that in 1929, when the crash occurred, he got to be quite poor. He had one butcher shop left, a small butcher shop, and that's where he spent his time. His daughter, which I had a pointer, but I don't. Okay, Ilona, her, worked in the shop as well, and so did their son, Um, another sister was Piroshka, whom you'll also meet later, who was a musician of sorts. And the reason I say that is because she played the accordion. And my father, who was a classical cellist, held firmly the belief that the accordion is not an instrument and the people who play it are not musicians. It's a machine and they're machinists. Piroshka didn't accept that and didn't appreciate it too much either, but people have their predispositions and convictions, I guess. Okay, so that is the Akush family. Next. That's the Sudfeld family, and that's how you spell Sudfeld in a language that has an umlaut, which English doesn't, and so that's how I became S-U-E. Okay, this is I don't have a photo that's equivalent to the one you saw of the other family. So this is my father and my uncles on the Sudfeld side when they were little, obviously. That's my father. And these are his two next brothers. And over here came a latecomer, sort of an addendum, postscript, whatever you want to call it, named Shandor, Alexander, who was much, much younger than his brothers. And my father was kind of a in loco father because my grandfather on that side, next slide. Oh, got it. Okay. My grandfather on that slide, obviously the man over there, was a highly decorated war veteran, but along with his high decorations came a very grievous wound from which he never really recovered. And so he was disabled for the rest of his life from 1918 on, or 1917 on. So my father, who was the oldest son, sort of filled in for him. And my father, as I said, was a classical musician who also worked in dance bands playing saxophone and clarinet, but his preference was the cello, and I think he loved the cello more than he loved anything else in the world. I may be doing him an injustice, but I can tell you that he spent more time with the cello than with anybody else in the world. Hours of practice every day, and then went out and performed. Next to my grandfather is my grandmother, whom we knew as Momoka, who was the unquestioned queen, empress, goddess, I don't know, dictator of the family, and to the extent where she would tell her sons whom they could marry and whom they could not marry, and they did what they were told. Her major criterion for whom they could marry was that their family was well off, because our family wasn't, and they picked very well, except none of them counted on 1929, and most of them lost most of their money when the crash came. So we lived nicely, as I said, not richly, but we were okay. We didn't have to worry about food on the table, especially not with a butcher shop in the family. And we thought, as you think, that this is the way life was, and this is the way life was going to be, and we would get older in a nice, gentle way, and we would get, those of us who were young would settle and marry and have children, and I would finish school and get married and settle and have children. And that was the assumptive world. That was going to be it. We were going to be living in Hungary, finding a career if we didn't have one yet, and pursuing it. Okay. Next, please. In 1939, Germany began its course of expansion, and by 1942, it dominated almost all of Europe. If you look at that map, almost all of it is either red, which is occupied or allied with Germany, or pink, which is not occupied or allied, but friendly with Germany. And some of the so-called allies, like Franco's Spain, was also really on the side of Germany, but they didn't want to get into the fight. But they provided shelter, information, intelligence, some resources. And so on. And in 1942, things looked pretty bleak for anybody who opposed Germany and anybody whom Germany opposed. And as you know, in 1942, that included many, many Jews. And they were, as you also know, prime targets for wherever Germany dominated a country, the Jews were in trouble and in danger. Hungary was then ruled by a conservative but not fascist government of mostly aristocrats, military officers or former military officers, kind of well-settled, elitist, not democratic, but not oppressive government. The leader of that was a former admiral in the former Austro-Hungarian Navy. Hungary no longer had access to the ocean, so he was an admiral without a fleet. All he had was river boats on the Danube. And he was officially the regent of Hungary. He was a stand-in for the King of Hungary, Emperor of Austria, who was in exile because they had lost the war. And the fiction was that he was just a caretaker until the king could come back and take his throne and rule the country, but everybody knew that that wasn't going to happen ever. His name was Horthy Miklós. Remember the name. We'll get back to him. So he ran a country, he ran a government that was, I guess, what you would call genteelly anti-Semitic. In other words, there was no great persecution. There were no significant disabilities or restrictions on Jews. We could go into any business we wanted or any occupation that we wanted. Use the public amenities just like everybody else, use the public schools, go to parks, get on the Olympic teams, etc., etc. There was some things that Jews were not able to do, but not because they were legally prescribed, but because, for example, if you will, there were athletic clubs that would not take Jewish members, not because the government told them not to. This was sort of spontaneous grassroots anti-Semitism, which I think you could find everywhere. And as I read the history of Canada, it would certainly Canada was certainly not exempt from it. But in terms of official persecution or official barring you from anything, there was very little of that. The major example was what was called the numerus clausus, which was a quota on how many Jewish students were admitted into university. And if you applied and the quota was full, no matter how good your record was, you couldn't get in because the quota was filled. But aside from that, nothing much. I had an uncle who was not in that picture because he died young, who was very brilliant from what they tell me, and what they told me, and could not get into to a Hungarian university because the quotas were full, and so he had to settle for going to the Sorbonne, okay, which was sort of the continental equivalent of Cambridge and Oxford. Settling was kind of a misnomer. Anyway, he studied international law, won the gold medal as the highest ranking graduate when he came out, came back to Budapest, getting ready to start his brilliant career, and went to be shaved by a barber, was nicked with a straight razor, got sepsis. This was before penicillin had reached Hungary, and within a week or so he was dead. Yes, a sad loss. Think about it though, if he had survived, probably would have wound up in Auschwitz. Never know. Anyway, now in 1942, Hitler decided that it would not be nice to have Hungary as part of the Axis, that is, Germany, what was at one time Austria, but then became incorporated into Germany, Italy, and Japan, the tripartite Axis, and he invited Horthy to sign Hungary on to this group. And it's sort of like, I could come up with more contemporary examples of, yeah, sign on or else. Sign on voluntarily or else. And so Horthy did. Hitler had the largest and most organized, well-armed army in Europe at the time, and he was right on our borders. Hungary had probably about a tenth of as many people as Germany, and nowhere near the armaments and munitions factories and all of that. And so he joined. He also got back some of those territories that had been taken away after World War I. So there was a little carrot as well as the potential whip. Well, when you teamed up with Hitler, you didn't only get to be his ally in the war, you also got to be, if you knew what was good for you, his ally in persecuting Jews. Hitler didn't care about Jews one way or the other very much. He did care about Hungarian citizens, even if they were Jews. And he did his best for quite a while, protecting the Jewish population of Hungary. He did. I don't think he gets enough credit for that in current thinking, but he did his best, I think. And so, for example, when Hitler was busy with something else, conquering the rest of the world, and wasn't looking at Hungary, Horthy would fire ministers. They picked on the wrong side again. Hungary had a history of always picking the losing side to fight on. They did it again in World War II, and we were being bombed. The Western Allies had got close enough that their bombers could reach Hungary without having to stop and refuel someplace. The city was getting bombed pretty heavily, the railway lines and factories and all of that. We were losing lots of soldiers on the Eastern Front that had been sent there to help the Germans. Food was getting scarce because a lot of stuff was being exported to Germany, and so on. And Horthy went on the radio and announced that Hungary was surrendering. They were getting out of the war. Whereupon Hitler activated the occupying German army in Hungary, reinforced them, took over the government, arrested Horthy. Actually, they kidnapped his son and threatened to murder him if Horthy didn't get out. So he did. He resigned. He was deported. So the Germans took him away. And he was replaced by a native Hungarian, Nazi-like party called the Arrow Cross, Milos Kereszt. And they took it upon themselves to carry out the full Nuremberg laws and all the persecution that had happened in Germany and Poland and other occupied countries. So it came later to us than it had to many other countries in Europe. But when it came, they were determined to catch up. And Eichmann was sent to oversee the procedure. Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust more generally. And he took Hungary as his special enterprise. So things happened like we had to wear yellow stars on our clothes, and there were houses There were houses that were marked with a big yellow star, and all Jews had to live in one of those, and nobody else could live in one of those. And if you see the picture over there, you can see the tip of the yellow star. Yeah, there. That's me again, by the way. So, yeah, next one. Okay. This is the Arrow Cross militia. Here they are herding a group of Jews, most likely to their death. You could see the Arrow Cross flag up here. And you could also see that there were police officers guarding this activity. So they were not there to protect the Jews from these murderers. They were there to protect the murderers and also to catch the Jews if they tried to escape. So, there was a thank you for the Canadian police that are here guarding us. And the problem was in Hungary that the police were on the wrong side. One of the places where they took people was down to the bank of the Danube, where they marshaled them in groups of 3, tied them together, had them take their shoes off. This, by the way, is a memorial, so it's not the real original thing. Had them take their shoes off, and then lined them up on the bank, and shot the middle person in each trio, expecting that that person would fall into the river and pull the other 2 that were tied to him or her into the water also, where they would drown. And in the winter, of course, they would also die of hypothermia. It was very cold. They're very poor numbers, records of all of this stuff. The estimate of the people who were killed that way in the Danube was somewhere up to about 30,000. So the Nilosh used that method to save ammunition, so they didn't have to use 3 bullets where they only have to use 1. Okay. In 1944-45, in the winter, I will get to what was going on before that. The Red Army, the Soviet Army, reached the outskirts of Budapest, coming westward through Poland and so forth, and started what was considered to be the second worst siege in Europe in World War II, right after Stalingrad. The estimated death toll was someplace around 422,000 in 5 months of fighting in the siege. Again, the numbers are a lot of guesswork, and I don't know how reliable they are, but that was the estimate anyway. That's 422,000 out of a population of less than 1 million. Okay, half of the population. That was deaths, not counting wounds, disabled, maimed, etc. And there was also, as it says, a suspension of what we were used to in our assumptive world as what you have when you live in a city, like electricity and so on. We didn't have any of that anymore. Okay, so I've got some examples to tell you what happened. My grandparents, except for my paternal grandfather, went into the ghetto. I say went, were forced into the ghetto. My paternal grandfather had died a few years before that, the war hero, who had always assumed that because he was a war hero, whatever anti-Semitic legislation was passed, he and his family would be exempt. The Hungarians made a big deal out of honoring people who had fought for the Austro-Hungarian Empire and done well. Many Jews, by the way, did. He died before he could find out that he was wrong, because the Nazis didn't care at all about any of that. The three of them who went into the ghetto survived, but my mother's father and mother died very shortly after from all the privations that they endured, and starvation and so on. My Mamoka, my father's mother, the empress, survived. Everybody was very surprised that she eventually died. We weren't expecting that. She traveled out to see us when my father and I left Hungary. I'll get to that detail. And she didn't speak any English. She spoke some German. And when she landed in New York, my father and I went to meet the plane, and she came down out of the reception area, surrounded by other passengers, the pilots, the flight attendants, all chattering away at her and laughing, all that. She didn't understand a word they were saying, and they couldn't understand a word she was saying because she only spoke Hungarian. But she got very popular on that flight. I don't quite know how she did that. We had several great aunts, great uncles, and so on, cousins. Those who were older died in the ghetto or were taken to Auschwitz. My mother, as I told you, was a legal secretary. I think I told you. Anyway, she was. And she worked for a lawyer who did international entertainment law. So he did contracts for orchestras and movie actors and movies to come from other parts of Hungary other parts of Europe into Hungary, or to go from Hungary to other parts of Europe. One day, shortly after the German taking over the Hungarian government and everything, she was working, and two men in civilian clothes barged into her office, started shoving people around, ransacking files, throwing things around, and so on. And now here's the assumptive world. What do you do when something like that happens? You go and find a police officer, of course, and have him stop this crime. So she did. She left the office, went down to the street, found a police officer, said there were a couple of thugs vandalizing and assaulting people in my office. Police officer said, okay, let's go stop that, and went upstairs and confronted those two men and asked them to explain what they were doing. And they pulled out their ID, and one of them was an officer of the Gestapo, German secret police, and the other one was an officer of the Hungarian secret police. And they advised the police officer to make himself scarce, which he did very wisely, because otherwise he would have been in big trouble, probably wound up in Auschwitz himself. So he left, and these two secret policemen took down the names and addresses of everybody in the office and sent them home. A friend of my mother's advised her to go into hiding in case they came after her. She didn't. Partly she didn't because she didn't know where to hide me. I was 8 years old at the time. She could have hidden with this friend, but the friend didn't have room for more than one person, and so on. So and also she thought that what she had done was not so bad that they would bother to come after her for it. About a week or so later, early in the morning, was just waking up, there was a banging on the door, and when she opened it, there was one of those two policemen, secret police officers, and two German soldiers with rifles and bayonets fixed. And they told her to pack a small suitcase and go with them, which she did. And she came over to her. I was in bed. I was just getting up. And she kissed me goodbye. And I saw that she had tears in her eyes. And I couldn't understand that. I thought, I mean, she hadn't done anything bad. So that I thought, they'd take her down to the police station maybe and criticize her behavior and tell her not to try to intervene in the future and so on, and send her home. It turns out I was wrong too. That was my assumptive world. Your policeman was your friend. Nice to have that assumptive world back again, folks. Anyway, they took her away, and I never saw her again. She was taken to a holding camp in Hungary, and then from there to Auschwitz. And as you saw from the title slide, she perished there. We don't know how, we don't know what she died of. We didn't know that she had died for several years after the war. We were waiting for her to come back. Eventually gave up, and eventually got an affidavit from some women who had known her in Auschwitz and could testify that she had died. No. Go back. Okay. My father, told you, was a musician. He was drafted into what the Hungarian government, under pressure, set up, which was a forced labor service for all Jewish men between, I think, something like 17 and 50 some odd, being used for manual labor for the army. What again? Very, very badly trained microphone, Anyway, so they were doing things like making tank traps, digging ditches, clearing minefields by lining up and walking through the minefield, which is a very efficient way of clearing a minefield if you don't mind losing a fair number of your people, because the way you clear it is they step on a mine and it blows up, and then there's no mine there anymore. So the next person can go there with safely. That's what they use the Jewish laborers for. And their officers, who were Christian, were instructed that if they were in a situation where the unit was trapped, they should leave their troops there and save themselves, which, let me tell you, is not the way officers are usually trained in normal armies. So my father went into one of these forced labor units. Fortunately, he was sent to the Western Front, Austria, and when the Allies were coming close, he was sent on a death march along with his fellow prisoners, and ended up in the death camp Mauthausen, one of the worst, most cruel, vicious camps around, but he survived. And after he survived, after the war, he was given a job, because he spoke English, interrogating suspected war criminals and SS officers captured in the vicinity. He enjoyed it. And he did so well that they offered him a job at an American Army Officers Club in Vienna after this. The prosecutions were wrapped up. Everybody who needed to be hanged was hanged. He said, yes, he'd love that, but he'd want to go back to Budapest and get his wife and son and take them with him. And the army said, fine. Came back to Budapest. We waited for my mother to come home. As I said, my mother never did. And eventually, later that winter, the Russians were closing the border between Hungary and Austria, right? Hungary being within the Warsaw Pact area, the communist-dominated area, and Austria obviously not. So they were trying to close the border, and so we sneaked out. My father decided we better get out while we could. We sneaked out very adventurously, which I never quite understood what happened. We climbed into the window of a train, and then we climbed out of the window of the train and climbed into another one. Anyhow, we wound up in Vienna, and he took up his job. And through some very unfortunate circumstances, I wound up in a residential school where I was the only Jew, and everybody else came from a Nazi family. And fortunately, my father had taught me how to box, so I survived. Anyway, my uncle George was also in the labor force, labor units, but he was sent to the Eastern Front. Fortunately, not to Ukraine or Russia, but to Yugoslavia, and he escaped from his unit and found and joined a unit of partisans who were fighting against the Germans and the occupying Hungarians, mind you, and fought with them until the end of the war, when he came home and eventually wound up in the United States, as we did. So, who else we have there? Ilona. Ilona was the lady who worked in the butcher shop, and she was put into the ghetto with her parents, my maternal grandparents, and she would sneak out of the ghetto, capital crime, climb onto the top of a railway train, capital crime, take with her some household goods like sheets and pillowcases, plates, stuff like that, and took it into the countryside and traded it with the people there for food, capital crime. Okay. And then she sneaked back on top of another train, capital crime, and back into the ghetto, capital crime. So every time she did this, she could have been executed 6 times over. Okay. Fortunately, she never got caught. And she could have just been shot if a police officer or a soldier had seen her on top of the train. All he had to do was pick up his weapon and shoot her. Didn't have to arrest her or take her to a trial or anything like that. Fortunately, she got away with it. And eventually, she wound up in Australia, and she was determined to live to be 100 years old. Why? Because when you get to be 100 years old, the monarch sends you a birthday greeting. And by golly, she was going to have that from the Queen. And she lived to be 100 years old, and she got it. And she got another one that she hadn't expected from the Governor General of Australia. And having fulfilled her goal on Earth, a couple of months later, she died. Okay. Piroshka. Piroshka was the accordionist who thought she was a musician. When the war broke out, when Hungary joined the war, she was working in a band of all women, organized and directed by her husband, who was a character and a half, and they were in Turkey. And my uncle decided that they didn't want to go back to Hungary in the middle of a war and the persecution of the Jews, and so they would go someplace safe. And the closest safe place from Turkey was India. So they were going to go to India. To go to India from Turkey, by the most direct route, you had to go through China. But the part of China you had to go through was then occupied by the Japanese army. So they had to get a transit visa from somebody in the Japanese government system to allow them to go through the Japanese occupied Chinese area to go to India. Okay? Complicated. So they went to the Japanese passport consulate in, I think it was Ankara in Turkey, and they sat down with the Japanese consular official and explained their dilemma. And the man said, well, I understand your problem, and I can certainly sympathize with you not wanting to go back to Hungary, given how they're treating Jews and they're in the middle of the war and so on and so forth. So, I would love to give you a transit visa, but we have orders from Tokyo that because Hungary has joined the war with us on our side, but India is being ruled by the British, who are the enemy, we cannot let anybody go to India because they might aid the British war effort, which apparently had a shortage of female accordionists at the time. So the guy says, "So I'm sorry, I can't stamp your visa, but if I could, that's the rubber stamp I would use. And now, excuse me, I have to go to the washroom." Okay? A righteous among the Gentiles. They never knew his name, so he couldn't be no, appreciated and rewarded after the war. But my uncle, seeing the guy go out the door, rubber stamp, chomp chomp, and off they went through the Japanese occupied part of China to India, where they were interned as enemy aliens because Hungary was an enemy of the British Empire. Okay? Well, my uncle talked his way out of it. And then he went and talked his wife's way out of it. She was in a different camp. And they set up shop. I don't know what they used for resources to begin with. But anyway, they started a store. And eventually, I was told, and I'm not vouching for the truth value of this, that they opened and owned the first department store in Calcutta. Calcutta. I don't know if it's true or not, but they definitely did have a department store. I don't know whether it was the first. They also owned a jewel mine, and I don't know what's tracts of the jungle and so on. Unfortunately, my uncle, although he had many positive abilities, also had a negative lack of ability, and that was gambling. Now, they were past 1929 by a long shot, but he managed to lose all his money, or almost all of it. And they decided then to join my Aunt Ilona, who I by then was living in Sydney, Australia, and so they moved there and lived there the rest of their lives. Piroshka did not get to be 100, but she came well into her 90s, so they did okay. And her husband was a riot. I got to know him for a few years before he died, and he was a character. I could tell you lots of stories. We also played chess together, and he beat me about 4 times out of 5 every time. So, is that it? That's 3. Then someplace along, I guess, we come to me. You didn't have to remind me. One time I gave this talk, I forgot about me. It just went on. And my editor and chauffeur and collaborator and wife corrected me and said, you didn't tell your story. I said, you're right. Okay, so when my mother was taken away by those Germans, I was in the apartment by myself. And Ilona, who lived nearby, came to visit us pretty much every day. She came to visit and saw me alone, asked me what happened. I told her. So she took me to live with her. And after a while, she lived in a Yellow Star house. And then the ghetto was being set up. And she and my grandparents decided that things were only going to get worse. We're getting bombed every day anyhow. It's pretty bad. And so they decided that somebody from the family should have a chance to survive. And I was the youngest and the only child, so she decided it should be me. And come on. And they somehow found out that the International Red Cross had some orphanages dotted around the city, and that they were for war orphans, but they smuggled a few Jews in when they thought they could get away with it. And so they found a woman who was an employee of theirs when they were richer, and a Christian woman, who stayed very friendly with them and smuggled food to them, even when things were bad. And she agreed to smuggle me across the river to the other part of the city, Buda, and take me to that orphanage. That was a very dangerous thing for her to do. And it was dangerous for me too, because one of the things we had to do for me to be able to get out on the street at that time was to cut off the yellow star from my clothes. And that was a major no-no. If you were Jewish, you had to have that star showing. But then we couldn't have done it. And so she decided to take the chance, which was very dangerous for her. But again, luckily, we got away with it. And you might think about how many steps along the way I survived because of luck and nothing else. This time it was her compassionate willingness to take the chance and the luck that we got away with it. So she took me to the orphanage, and the orphanage accepted me. I was a good candidate for hiding because I was blonde and I had blue eyes. And, so I could get away with pretending that I wasn't Jewish. I didn't look Jewish. I didn't look what they considered Jewish. So they took me and they gave me a new name and a backstory about my father who was killed in fighting in the Hungarian army, and my mother who couldn't take care of me for some reason, and they would look after me. So I was in that orphanage when on Christmas Eve of 1944, the Russian army reached Buda and started that part of the siege. They had been in Pest before that. Pest is the other side. So we then went into the cellar and we stayed there for the next 2.5 months because it was dangerous to come up to the surface. And there was no food except occasionally the Red Cross had some in their warehouse and we got some of that. Mostly it was soybeans or soybean soup, soybean coffee, soybean vegetables, soybean bread, soybean whatever. And I have acquired a fairly permanent dislike of tofu. And we also went out and looked for food in destroyed houses where nobody was there anymore. Maybe they left something. We dug into the soil under the snow to see if in some vegetable garden somebody might have left a carrot or a potato or something, and so on. And as I said in that slide, there was no hot water, so we didn't wash for a couple of months. I didn't mind that too much. Didn't brush our teeth, didn't change our clothes, didn't take off our clothes because we never knew when we'd have to get up and move. And we did have to move 3 or 4 times when the building in whose cellar we were hiding up above was destroyed by the bombs or the artillery or the tanks or whatever. And then we have to find another place. The Red Cross usually found it for us. Then we had to get ourselves there. And again, here's an example for pure luck. Okay. One night we were going from from a destroyed building to a not yet destroyed building. And it was a full moon and it was reflecting off the snow. So it was very light. And we were lined up and climbing over a little fence. And some soldiers saw us and probably thought we were an attacking force and opened up on us with a machine gun. Okay? I don't know how familiar you are with machine guns, but the way it works is there's a shot, and then the mechanism feeds the next cartridge into the breech before the next shot. Okay? And if you're shooting at a line of people lined up like that, like you people are, you start at one end and you go to the other end. So the machine gun fired, and the kid on my left was hit, and the man traversed the gun, and it fired, and the kid on my right was hit. But when it was pointing at me was the time that the next cartridge was being fed into the gun, and so there was no shot. Okay? Pure dumb luck. Another tale of of luck, I guess, was we were looking for food, and we were lined up the other way, behind each other, with one of the women who took care of us, and I happened to be at the front of the line, and we ran into an army patrol, and the sergeant in charge of the patrol said to the woman who was leading us, "Who are these? What's going on here?" And she said, "Oh, they're war orphans. Very sad. We're an orphanage, and most of their fathers were either fighting or have been killed, and so forth." And the guy looked at me. Remember, blonde hair and blue eyes. And he said, "What a handsome Aryan boy," and gave me a bar of chocolate. Oh. Okay. As much as we enjoyed that chocolate, of course I shared it, but as much as we enjoyed that chocolate, I had a special joy in thinking, if you only knew what you were doing, buddy, you'd be so upset. You would have been. Okay. Last episode was after the war, or at least after the siege. We were upstairs. We weren't in the cellars anymore, but there was still nothing. None of the resources and amenities have come back yet. They were going to, but they weren't yet. And so we were still eating soybeans. And the door of the house opened, and a Red Army officer walked in, and he was obviously a pretty high-ranking officer. He had a beautiful, sumptuous fur coat on, and nice big fur hat, and beautiful boots, and everything, much better than the average soldier or even the average line officer had. So he was probably at least a major, maybe a colonel. And he came in, and like everybody else said, "Who are these and what's going on?" And the lady in charge of us, now that the war was over, she thought it was okay. She said, "Well, we are an orphanage, and some of the children are Jewish, and their parents have been taken away," and so on. And so the guy looked at her, and he looked around, and he looked back out the door that he had come in with. And he unbuttoned his big fur coat, and he unbuttoned the tunic with all kinds of medals under it, and he had a Mogen David around his neck. Now, the thing that in retrospect gets me, it didn't then, I didn't think anything of it, was that he had to look around carefully to make sure none of his other Red Army comrades could see that he was a Jew. Okay? Told me something, confirmed something that I had already known about Stalin and his level of anti-Semitism. So anyway, then he buttoned himself up, and he said to the woman in charge of us, "Can I get you anything? Do you need anything for the children?" And she said, "Well, we haven't had meat in about 4 or 5 months, and I bet they would appreciate a meat meal." Russian said, "No problem." Walked out the door. Of course, there was no fuel or anything, so all the transport was horse-drawn. And there was a horse and wagon coming past the building, and he pulled out his pistol and shot the horse. Didn't say a word. And the man who owned the horse and the wagon was quite upset, but Russian soldiers weren't particularly concerned about Hungarian civilians getting upset. In fact, the guy was lucky he didn't get shot himself. I guess this officer didn't think we'd eat the owner of the horse. Anyway. Okay, so now I want you to do a little pretend thing. You are a woman, pretend, if you're not really a woman, that you were trained as maybe a nurse, maybe a teacher, social worker, something like that. And here you are in charge of about 20 hungry kids and about 4 or 5 hungry adults, including yourself. And here is a dead horse. Now what? Okay. I probably wouldn't have thought of it, but she was a very resourceful lady, and she went around the neighborhood knocking on doors and finally found a butcher. Now the butcher's store was not open. No stores were open yet because there's nothing to sell. but she made a deal with the butcher that he would come and butcher the horse, the carcass, and give us a portion of the meat, and he could keep the rest and either eat it himself or sell it. I'm sure he sold it. So we had horse. First meat in 4 or 5 months, first square meal in quite a while. And I always warn people, if somebody tells you that horse meat tastes like chicken, don't believe it. It does not taste like chicken. It does not taste like beef. It does not taste like lamb or mutton. It doesn't taste like anything except horse. But if you haven't had meat for 4 or 5 months, horse is pretty good. Okay. So that was a highlight of this thing. So there we were. The siege was over, and I was waiting for somebody to come and find me, and I was sure nobody would, because I was there on a different name. I remember I got false documents, and I was in a place that was 4 or 5 buildings other than the one where I had been left off. How could they possibly find me? One day I was sitting outside, and I saw a woman coming up the street with a big basket under her arm. And as she got closer, I realized it was Ilona with a big basket of food. And I visited her many times in Australia, and I always reminded her that that was the happiest moment of my life, before or since. And it still has that record, although I've had many happy moments since then. Okay, my timekeeper is indicating that I should shut my mouth in her polite and loving way. I do have some more stuff, but maybe you've had enough. You tell me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Dr. Sufel, thank you so much. That was a very interesting story. We're so lucky to live in today's times. It was a terrible time at that time. I'm not sure where it went. Just a moment. It was blue. There was a folder. There was a folder up here. And I don't know where. Well, you know what? It's under the glass. No, that's something else. I had notes that were going to be my official notes to read to introduce the mayor. So I'm going to ad lib. Actually, I think you might have my folder. It's only. Oh, these are. I'm not sure. Okay, it's with respect and gratitude that I have the opportunity to introduce our next speaker. 6 years ago, when the Bayit's president, Michael Sachs, had the vision for the Bayit to host the inaugural Holocaust Remembrance Day event, he approached the Richmond mayor, Malcolm Brody, and asked if the mayor could do a proclamation declaring January the 27th, Holocaust Remembrance Day in the city of Richmond. Without hesitation, Mayor Brody not only agreed to make the proclamation at our inaugural event, but he also agreed to make the proclamation on an annual basis. Since first being elected to the Richmond City Council as a city councillor in 1996, and for a second term as councillor in 1999, Malcolm Brody was elected to his first term of office as mayor in 2001 in a special by-election, followed by being elected to 7 successive terms, making him the longest-serving mayor in Richmond's history. Throughout his tenure, Mayor Brody has shown understanding, compassion, and leadership, caring about all citizens, no matter their culture or religion. The Richmond Jewish community is very grateful to our mayor for supporting our annual Holocaust Remembrance Day event, and we thank Mayor Malcolm Brody for making our annual proclamation. I give you his worship, Mayor Malcolm Brody.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Keith. I am not kidding when I say this is this event for me, and I think the counselors who have joined me would agree. This is one of the most memorable events and thought-provoking. But when you talk about my introduction, you know, sometimes people are a little leery. They don't know what to call you, your worship or whatever. So I just tell them, if words fail you, you know, your Royal Excellency or Your Highness will do. But this is, I mean, we kid, but it's a very solemn occasion, the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. It actually is tomorrow, and Keith and the rabbi were kind enough, because we have council meetings tomorrow that really we can't just avoid, that we would have this event tonight just on the eve. But when you talk about the 80th anniversary, it does remind us that nobody's getting any younger, and that the stories, there are fewer survivors, and the stories are that much more important. And so I hope there has been some attempt. I don't know whether you've ever kept records or you've kept videos of the stories that have been told, but they are some of the most memorable stories that I've ever heard. As you know, I do have a number of city councilors who have joined me tonight, and we all want to remember aspects of our history, such as through this International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It commemorates and honors the 6 million European Jewish victims of the Holocaust, and it reminds us and current and future generations that we need to develop educational programs to help prevent future genocides and reprehensible crimes against humanity, and how anti-Semitic incidents are increasing in Canada. And they've accelerated, I would think, since October the 7th, a year ago. And they're being committed more openly every year. And I just keep emphasizing the October 7th, 2023 event as Exhibit B. Michael talked about Exhibit A as the Holocaust. Exhibit B has to be October 7th. And what has transpired since then, I'm sure everybody in this room has got their fingers crossed that really there is an improvement happening that's going to be lasting and be very significant in Israel. We need to continue to work together to fight any kind of discrimination and build a community that celebrates diversity, compassion, and inclusion as our way of life. So let us learn from history and ensure that we have a society that puts shared humanity above all. To mark this important occasion, I have signed a proclamation for International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and I'll just read, it's a long thing, but I'll just read a part of it. And so I would ask Keith and the rabbi to come up and join me so we can present this. Whereas current research shows that 1 in 5 Canadian youth are unaware of events that occurred during the Holocaust, while 62% of Canadians aged 18 to 34 are unaware of how many Jews were killed during the Holocaust. And whereas Statistics Canada reports that Jewish people are the most frequently targeted ethnocultural group when it comes to police-reported hate crimes, such as crimes taking place once every 24 hours in Canada. Now, And I won't read the rest of it, but you will have this as a permanent proclamation here in your files. So now, therefore, I, Malcolm Brody, as the mayor of the city of Richmond, do hereby proclaim January 27th, 2025 as International Holocaust Remembrance Day in the city of Richmond.
That's the photographer right over there.
Just wanted to say that we really appreciate Mayor Brody's support every year and his taking the time. And it's always without hesitation. You know, he always comes, and we don't take it for granted. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. No.
This brings us the program to action.
No.
So I've got another 10 pages to read, and then we'll be able to go home. I wanted to once again thank our keynote speaker, Dr. Neufeld, and also thank all the elected officials that came and all the friends that are here to remember and to say never again. And a special thank you to Michael Sachs for coming up with the idea 6 years ago. Good night, everyone.
Thank you very much. We're going to try to take a picture with the survivors if we can, next to the candles, together with our elected officials. We're trying to take a picture behind the candles. Bravo.
Oh, sure. Sure. We can do that. Sure.
We're going to try a special thank you to Sylvester for coming on and taking documents.
Absolutely. Should he go through here? If you guys could just stand in front of him, that's fine. Just go in front, yeah. I can't.
Thank you so much. I'll send you the picture. Thank you. Thank you all for doing it. Thank you. Thank you.
You're waiting for the best part, even. Thank you for a second. Oops, yeah, let's take one.
Oh yeah, this keeps sliding. Yeah. Thank you. Scary? Just recently but I'll be what a wonderful carry up the wall as the politicians strike. That's where she was watching over and still watching over. That's what mom's doing. Never get away. She was always fantastic. Same thing with Laura. Laura like I tell my friends this morning, it's actually me. All right, sir. Have a good night.
Good night.
Nice to meet you.
That's the end of our. That's the end for today, International Holocaust Remembrance Day. From Richmond, the Bayit, 2 hours. Good night.